I'm Matt Booker.
I'm Dave Laird.
And I'm Shazia. There's 26 of me in total, and I am in here on the Great Concavity.
Oh.
All right. Shazia, welcome to episode 32. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for having me.
A fellow convexityite. And there have actually been...
waste.
Yeah, there's been actually very few of us on this show appearing. So I did the math today, and you're actually just the third Canadian guest to be featured on The Great Concavity. The other two were my wife and our friend Amy Peltier. But then I guess if we count Jeff Severs as like an honorary Nuxter, then would be then you'd be the fourth.
He's a dual agent.
Yes, that's right. So welcome to the show. Shazia, maybe before I introduced you, maybe let's break down your very obscure Infinite Jest reference there. Because I had to look it up. You sent it to me in advance, but I was like, oh, this sounds familiar. And then I had to do some digging.
Yeah,
it was Let's see if Matt can get it.
There are 26 of me. Is that what you said? Say it
again.
Mm-hmm.
There's 26 of me in total, and I'm in here.
I mean, is that the alphabet? 26 of me? I'm in here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the I'm in here, obviously, is hell, yeah.
It's that bit when Murat is in the at the Ennet House waiting for the interview, and he's talking to this addict who says, "No, everyone's not real, and we're all metal people. If you look closely under the layer of skin, you can see the gears whirring, and there's only 26 of us in a room, and everyone else is not real," or something like that.
Wow, yeah, I did not catch that. That's great.
Oh, that's good. So, Shazia, how many times have you, I guess we'll get into this more, but how many times have you read Infinite Jest cover to cover now?
Oh, I would say 3.5, maybe 4.5. Yeah, I feel like sometimes I've just started and then dropped off to read some other Wallace, but I'd say 3.5.
Hey, that's pretty good. Awesome. Okay, cool. So Shazia is from Vancouver, BC, which is very close to where I am. And she works there as a poet and a writer and a reviewer. And she's received the Robert Croach Award for Innovative Poetry this year in 2017. She was a finalist for the 2016 National Magazine Awards. She's had pieces published in Quill and Choir, Vallum, Metatron's Omega, which sounds like a transformer, the Puritan and Canadian Literature. And you had your first chapbook published this year called Prosopopoeia. Am I saying that right? Cool.
Yeah.
Published by Anstruther Press, and you have a debut book of poetry coming out next year called Port of Being from Insomniac Press.
Yeah.
Cool.
Those publications must be so boring to everyone who's not a writer in Canada.
Specifically a poetry writer.
Yeah.
That's cool. You also teach creative writing, and you work as a poetry editor for Prism International Magazine.
Mm-hmm.
Did I cover all of the main... Cover all the CV lines there?
Yeah. Somebody please hire me after May 2018 thing.
And then, more pertinently to the context of Wallace here, you have been a guide for Poor Yorick Summer, Sacred Jest, and the current Infinite Jest online read Ennet House, which are all dedicated to reading Wallace's magnum opus in an online context with people from all over the world. And then Shazia is also an MFA student at UBC in Vancouver. And a very fun fact is you're currently taking a postmodern U.S. fiction class with past guest Jeff Severs.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool. So welcome to the show again, Shazia.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah. So you've been a guide for 3 reads of Infinite Jest. Maybe walk us through like how you came to Wallace and then how you got involved in not just one, but like 3 separate times of being a guide for Infinite Jest. That's just like, I did it once for Infinite Winter, and it was really fulfilling, but like so much work. So I just deeply respect that you've done this 3 times. So maybe give us a bit of a history on that.
Yeah, just gotta keep sticking to the big book, right? But the first time I actually had a reading group experience was with your group, Infinite Winter. And I'd started then, and I just read along with you guys, and I found it so fun just to, write in the comments and blog alongside it. Though I fell off about, 3/4 of the way through because somebody started a Pale King group, and I was just
Oh, really?
yeah.
I didn't hear about that one.
Yeah, I think it started in May or June sometime. It was just announced on the listserv.
Was that your first time reading Infinite Jest, or had you read it previous to Infinite Winter?
I'd read it before that.
Yeah,
once.
I thought so.
Yeah.
Cool.
But my first ever Wallace story that I read was Good Old Neon. And just after that, it just blew my mind, and I just bought everything else. And I read it, I think, when I was 21 or 20 or something like that. And I just gotten out of rehab.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. So
That's a pretty formative time to hit that.
Yeah, no kidding. I swear, Infinite Jest just really, really helped me through my life at that point because I didn't even know about Wallace's history or what the book was about. I was just, doing a lot of reading, and I was like, oh, I should read David Foster Wallace because I haven't read anything by him, and everyone talks about him. I don't know anything. And then I read Good Old Neon without reading his biography or anything about him, and it was just whoa.
Yeah. Wow. Matt's a very, very large, big old, good old Neon fan as well.
Yeah, that's one of the stories I go back to. I mean, I think it's probably his best short story, or the one that I would recommend the most. It's weird because I don't think of him as a story writer, but he clearly wrote a lot of stories, and that's the way a lot of writers make money, right? Selling stories. But the group read aspect that goes into Infinite Jest, I'm curious to hear you talk about that because I think there's a lot of group therapy that goes into being in a group read. So I'm curious what you have to say about what kind of experience you had leading one of those groups.
When I was with Poor Yorick Summer, which was guided by Phil Militich. I hope I'm saying his name right. But Phil's from Ontario, and we'd known each other through the listserv, and I joined the group with 2 other guides, and that was just so much fun, especially because we were all Canadian. And
yeah, that was awesome. I love that.
I was writing my post 2 or 3 in the morning, just the day before it was due, and that was so much fun because it wasn't premeditated, and I felt this sense that I was guiding people, but then I would always end up confusing people. And then Joe, who was another of the guides, Joe DeLuca, he would always clarify my post the day after when it was his turn to post. It was just very neurotic and so much fun. And
his posts were just rebuttals of your post every week.
Sometimes, yeah. And we all fell behind, and that's something I always forget. When I was reading, guiding Ennet House. I just fell off, and I'm like, oh, I'm behind on the readings. And then a really nice gesture on Reddit reminded me, it's okay, everyone falls behind and everything. And I remembered, oh yeah, in Infinite Winter, people fell behind, and even in For Yorick Summer, people fell behind. So I shouldn't be trying to push it on as hard as I can.
Yeah, no kidding. Huh. So how did you get involved with Phil Miletic, who, by the way, just got married? So Phil, if you're listening, congratulations.
Congratulations, Phil.
Very cool. Yeah, Phil was at the conference, not this year, but last year. So we got to hang out a fair bit, which was awesome. Yeah, how did you and Phil hook up? How did he come to ask you to be a guide?
I think it was through the listserv that I met Phil. Or
you guys met on the listserv. Okay, cool. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Cool.
I can't remember if I might have known him before, through publishing and stuff, but it might have been on the listserv.
I remember he put out a call for readers and guides on the listserv, and that this was a part of a project I think he was doing for his PhD. I'm not sure, but
yeah, that's right.
Is related to online communities, and I thought this is really interesting because I've seen these online communities, or the group reads of Infinite Jest really started with the Infinite Summer in 2009 after Wallace died. And, seeing the kind of need for that has been interesting to watch it reoccur, because I thought, people could always go back and just read these posts, they're there. And then, there's another one. Let's say there's Infinite Winter, and then there's Summer of Jest, and then there's, Poor Yorick Summer. People can go back and read these. Do they but they still want the sense that like I'm reading it right now with other people who are reading it right now. Do you know?
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? Like why is that?
I think it's just because there's so much to look at and so much to analyze, and it's just so much more fun with a lot of people in the same room, right? Because we're all, or people who take to Infinite Jest are generally kind of lonely and depressed, in my experience.
Fair enough.
You know,
Fair enough.
so it's just fun to make friends and talk and nerd out without having all the social awkwardness of in real life conversation. That's sometimes a lot of work.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah, there's something about like immediate feedback that I guess is fairly compelling.
Mm.
That if you don't have any way to do that by reading like old message boards, I'm sure you could glean a lot from it, but you wouldn't have a sense of like the same kind of sense of human connection, I guess.
Mm-hmm, totally.
Which I suppose is a lot of what Infinite Jest is about.
Yeah, yeah.
It's kind of thematic.
As you know, we'll always have these admissions come out like, oh, I can relate to Oren, I can relate to Lent, and it's like, it's all good. We're on Reddit and we're friends forever, so it's fine.
And then you red flag the guy who said he can relate to Randy Lenz, and you're like, never talk to that guy again.
Yeah, that's not really the point of the book. But.
Hey, I think there's a bit of Lenz in all of us. You know?
But for the guides, I think it's another challenge too, in that it can be overwhelming, at least for me, to try to say something new about the book that especially because I wrote a couple of posts for Infinite Summer, and then I think I wrote a guest post for Infinite Winter, and then Summer of Jest, and it's like trying to say something new about it. That can be challenging too, because then if you go back and look at all of the stuff that's been written, it's like, what is there to say? And then I don't know. I feel like maybe there is a lot left to say, but it's hard to find that balance sometimes.
Yeah, I super tired of a lot of the posts from Poor Yorick Summer or Sacred Jest, just because it was so difficult to come up with new things all the time. But then I found the conversations always made things new. So this time we had this conversation about Joelle's veil, and someone said something that went into a conversation about dysmorphia, which is this sort of OCD-related disorder where someone has a view of their body that's very exaggerated. So their body wouldn't actually be disfigured, but they would think that it is, and that would prevent them from interacting with people. And that was something I hadn't considered about Joelle's veil before, because there's so many speculations about whether she's disfigured or not, or
Did the acid incident actually happen? Is Molly not a reliable narrator? All that stuff. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's an interesting thought. Yeah.
Yeah. So dysmorphia was one of the new things that I thought about this reading.
That's cool. Having done this 3 times, Shazia, what is your, obviously there's the thing where you want to have some insightful stuff about what's happening in the book to make, especially first time readers, have it make sense. But then, how do you say something original about that? And then at what point do you sort of make the post sort of more personal about yourself, or about the ways that what the book makes you think about in your own life, in your own experiences? Where do you find kind of the balance? How have you kind of approached that in your several times at this?
Yeah, it's really interesting because I feel like Infinite Jest is so personal for me, so I always find myself holding back on how it relates to my own life. But then when I did Sacred Jest with Emily Hoffman, she had this method of reading, which she wanted to look at Infinite Jest as a kind of sacred text, which is odder than it actually sounds. But the technique was to use this method of reading called Lectio Divina, and that's like a 4-part process. That's Benedictine practice of reading, and basically you pick a line at random and then talk about what's going on in the immediate text, and then zoom out and relate it to the whole, and then see how that applies to your life. So it's always got this personal aspect involved, which is very, very much like close reading, I find. So that was really interesting, reading Infinite Jest consciously like that.
That's cool. I found for me when I was guiding Infinite Winter, I would tend to write about Canada and Canadian stuff a lot, because for me it was kind of low hanging fruit, but for non-Canadians, we needed some explanation. So I kind of tapped into my 10th grade social studies history teacher, self and just kind of like talked a lot about Canada. So that was kind of a nice like way to make it sort of personal, but also help readers understand this other aspect of the text that they might not have got.
Yeah, I remember your posts about that, and I remember also going on a similar trajectory because of your posts and watching this movie called Corbeau, which is about the FLQ before in the 70s and how all the separatist stuff started. Yeah, it was a really good movie, and it was all because of your posts. I was like, yeah, I should be thinking about that.
That's cool. I guess that would have been harder with Poor York Summer if all the guides are Canadian. You can't. There's only so much you guys can.
Well, that's a good point. Is I never thought much about that, just a purely Canadian aspect of it. And it's like what you want to see. Like speaking to, guests we've had on the show who are Australian, for example, they actually find a fair amount of stuff about Australia in the book. And I was like, really? I never even thought there was anything about Australia in the book, but there is. So I think that is interesting to keep it, fresh in some ways, is like finding all of these different angles that other people see that, maybe a typical reader wouldn't. But eventually, like, is that going to be exhausted? And if so, like, I guess as a poet, I'm interested in Shazia and what you think of, like, I think what's not exhaustible in the short term, at least, is like at the sentence level. And like, if you could speak to that, or if there's something in the book that is, really struck you, that's memorable at the sentence level.
I didn't pick out a passage, but there's so many. Like I could probably just open the book. But I feel like the thing that really draws me as a poet, I guess, to Infinite Jest is just the precision. Like there's this obsession with trying to articulate something as closely and as truly and as attentively that I feel myself when I'm trying to write poems. Like I'm trying to stay true to the conditions of the poem and how it arose and just the structure of things. And I find that also in Wallace's sentences. I was just going to call him David, like he's my best friend ever.
Call him Dave.
That's fine. I mean, to me, that's something like on a reread, I go back to it. There are sentences where it's just like, oh man, I forgot this existed. And it's, and it's probably something like that on every page that I find is just, a quote worthy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, my book has so many pencil marks. I'm trying to ignore them right now and trying to pay attention to the text.
Matt, to your knowledge, in the Ransom archive, is there any like evidence that Wallace did poetry?
No,
but I've never heard anything.
I think the closest thing, I mean, besides his like Juvenilia, like his poem about his mom when he was in third grade, that's pretty good.
And isn't the Pale King from a line from Tennyson's poem?
I think that's right. The opening of the Pale King too. I was going to say there's two sections of the Pale King that were published in Triquarterly as really kind of prose poems, and that opening thing, I think it's debatable if that was intended to ever be part of the Pale King, and Michael Peach picking that as the opener is kind of like, acknowledging that it's one of the most, openly like literary parts of the book that's really just striving for this kind of catalog of names. It has nothing to do with the rest of the book per se.
Wow, yeah. When I was reading The Pale King, I actually didn't know that the first part was published as prose poems, because when I first read it, I was thinking about how much like language poetry it is.
Yeah.
And in that McCaffrey interview, Wallace talks about, how bad avant-garde is, like bad language poetry, where you have to know a whole bunch of things before you can actually understand what's going on. But when I was reading the part of The Pale King that reminded me of language poetry, it wasn't because it was bad. It was just because, all the way it was written, it was kind of, to me, upsetting that cause and effect logic of sentences, like sense-making sentences, I guess. So to me, that was like language poetry was just like refusing closure and creating meaning through the way things are set beside each other instead of leading to each other.
I think that's a great point. It's really also trying to use imagery, I think, to stand in for language. And there's an image in that book where, in that passage where the narrator kicks over a clod of dirt, and there are all of these little passages that are earthworms have eaten it out, and trying to make sense of that pattern, I think is like a little allegory in itself for trying to make sense of language and the activity of human beings. It also bothered me that those passages being published in Triquarterly under the names of, I think, Peoria number 9 and Peoria number 4, they were not acknowledged in the book and in Pale King. So like on the acknowledgments page, it didn't say like, oh, this parts of this had been published in Triquarterly as Peoria. And I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it should be fixed by now, because those two passages, including the opening passage, to me are the most poetic things he ever wrote.
Yeah.
Yeah, that should definitely have been acknowledged as the, whole new career path for me if everything else goes to shit.
Well, and he also wrote that book review of the best American prose poems.
Yeah.
And he really heaped a lot of praise on one particular, I think the guy's name was John Davis. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but it was the best American prose poems that he wrote in an interesting style of that review, and then paid for an ad of some prose poems in there that he really loved.
I don't remember John Davis. John Davis or John Davies?
I know John Davis also did Garfield, so I don't want to confuse him.
Hey man, you can do Garfield in poetry, right? They're not mutually exclusive.
Anything goes. The sleepy, depressed cat. Yeah, it could work. Yeah.
No, it was John Davis. Yeah. I mean, same name. I guess it's a common name, but he had a book called The Scrimmage of Appetite, and Wallace paid for an ad of that book. He was pretty critical of the other. The whole genre, I think, of prose poetry, such as it is, because it's like hard to define. As like, is it a poem or is it prose? Should it be one or the other? Is there something that's a third way? And he said that John Davis was an example of someone who was sort of able to do it, really well as a third thing. And I think that was the only one that he really called out. So we should go back and read Scrimmage of Appetite and then edit that in here. And we can talk about prose poetry.
Yeah, send me a post-recording recording. I'll splice it.
But no, I think that's interesting in that when Wallace went to University of Arizona for his MFA, and maybe you could talk about this since you're in an MFA program, there's a pretty clear split between the poets and the prose people, the fiction writers, and really they didn't have a lot of typical interaction, especially in the classes that they took. Although maybe in the literature classes, not in the writing classes. So he was exposed to and friends with people in the writing program I know who were poets.
Right, like Mary Carr and other people. But yeah, at UBC, the MFA program is like multidisciplinary, so we're supposed to do 3 streams, so fiction, nonfiction, and poetry, or another 3 things if you want. So there's some interaction, but not in the same class, I'd say. So poetry is fairly split off from fiction. But it's interesting that you say that, because I'm editing this magazine called Prism International, and we came up with a themed issue, and we wanted to make the theme liminal. So that would include dreamlike states, and also cross-genre work that blurs the line between like poems and prose, because that's really something interesting to me, and that I find doesn't happen in the creative writing program, because the separation and boundaries are clearly encouraged. So.
Well, and do you find that the one group kind of looks down on the other?
Mutual distaste.
Because I'm thinking here of another one of my favorite writers, who's Roberto Bolaño, and he started out, as a poet and really considered himself to be a poet first and foremost.
Oh, really?
And really wrote some pretty nasty things about other fiction writers, saying that, poetry was kind of the highest form of language. And that's an idea going back, centuries.
Sure.
But then later on, said he switched to write prose to make money. And that's also like a way of, it's a dig, but it's also like, it's true. And that there's very few like commercially successful poets.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't say I feel that animosity in school, but there's definitely a separation. But I feel that animosity in myself. Like I'm trying to write fiction right now, and I feel like one of the reasons I'm starting to write stories, or really want to write stories, is just because I want people to read my stuff and understand it.
Right.
That's a big problem in your usual line of work.
Yeah, so I put the poetry aside right now. I'm just kind of trying to write it whenever it happens. But I'm really, really trying to write stories just because I want to. Well, I've been infected by Wallace, so. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. Like a while back, you emailed me about like, hey, I'm in an NFA, but I kind of like am so into Wallace that maybe I want to like jump ship, possibly to like just be like do Wallace studies. Like, how did you do that? What was your experience?
Yeah.
I thought that was so interesting that.
Yeah, it's still very tempting, especially being in Severs's class now, when I'm just like feeling so excited reading Pynchon, and it's so good for my writing just to actually read and analyze work instead of trying to generate it yourself. But yeah, I'm still thinking of jumping ship, although maybe just like another ship next to this ship.
Yeah. What else are you guys reading in that Severs class? You said you're reading some Wallace as well.
Yeah, we're reading Adult World from Brief Interviews, which.
Oh wow.
Yeah. They're going to be harrowing. Yeah, and we're reading the McCaffrey interview, and we're reading Cosmopolis, DeLillo's, which I'm so excited about. Yeah, I'm going to write on that.
Mm-hmm. Have you finished reading it yet?
I've read Cosmopolis before, but we haven't started reading it for the class yet.
Right. Huh.
Yeah, cool. Adult World, I think at least one of the two, weird stories appeared in Esquire magazine originally. And I remember I associate that with Gary Shandling was on the cover of that magazine. And if you're a Gary Shandling fan, like it's got to be bizarre to pick that up and then read this short story from David Foster Wallace about like a porn store. I mean, in a way, I guess it fits, but it's a weird kind of context that it was originally published in. I'll say that. But again, not too many poets publishing in Esquire magazine. I mean, no offense, but I'm just saying it's a different like economy.
Oh yeah, totally. There's absolutely no money in poems, like compared to actually think about money when I send stories, and I'm like, oh, if I send it here, it'll be about a $200 thing, or if I send it here, it'll be a $100 thing. But with poems, I definitely don't think that way. It's just they're just there.
You poems are like $25.
You're losing money.
15 sometimes.
15. Oh yeah, that's kind of bleak, huh?
Yeah. So my magazine pays $40, and it's open to Americans and Canadians, so please send work.
Hey, nice plug. That's good.
Yeah, tell us how to get in touch with that.
We got a space for that at the end of the show. So Shazia, with them, I'm wondering about the most current read, Ennet House. You're doing it. So the Twitter handle is Ennet House YVR. Is that right?
I think it might be Infinite Jest YVR.
YVR, which for those not in the know, YVR is the airport code for Vancouver's airport.
Not that I'm an internationalist or anything. I mean,
right. So you guys are almost done. It ends on Monday, and I remember seeing when you guys started it that you were planning to do like 4 actual real meetings of people who lived in Vancouver who were part of the read. Did that ever happen? If so, how did it go? I'm really fascinated by that.
Well, it didn't pan out. I think there was about 7 or 8 people who had shown interest, and then scheduling didn't work out, and things came up, and people had different things to do. And so the in-person group never worked out, but the Reddit group took off, and I was surprised by how many people there were online. Like there was 250 people, and I was expecting like 10 or 20 or something.
That's great.
Yeah.
Huh.
because originally I wasn't intending to do this. Like I'd made a post for when I was guiding Poor Yorick Summer. I made a post on the UBC Creative Writing Forum saying, there's going to be an in-person group in tandem with Poor Yorick Summer, and it starts in 2016 at this date. And then someone from this year saw the post and they said, oh, I'd be really willing to read it. So that's how I started Ennet House. Somebody wanted to read it. So.
Oh, that's interesting. I think that there were, with the original Infinite Summer, there were some in-person groups in New York. And, that's a kind of different experience where you're not just committing to reading something online, but like you're in a lot of ways taking a big risk to go out and like meet some people from the internet. Which, I've done that. I've done that a fair amount of that myself. And I have always enjoyed it. It's always been interesting and it's always been rewarding. But I do think it is a different beast than just like, reading some posts online or posting your own like blog entries.
Yeah, that's like another level of vulnerability, right?
Yeah, and I felt super responsible. Like when I had an in-person group in tandem with Poor Yorick Summer, like 3 or 4 people came out, and they were all so nervous. And I was like, oh, I thought I was nervous. And all of a sudden, I find myself like, yeah, let's do this. We can go passage by passage and just. So I felt super responsible, and people were actually, opening up and willing to talk about the things that made them uncomfortable. Like Lens made a lot of people just like very, very uncomfortable, and
rightfully so.
Yeah, but in Poor Yorick Summer, I'd sympathize with Lens, as the only person who's doing drugs in the novel. And I'd sympathize with him, which I think it was the most commented on post. So, yeah.
I guess him and Hal and the Peemster are active users.
Yes, yeah, and Hal.
Yeah. Some drugs harder than others, I suppose.
That is true. And some people don't see weed as a drug. But it definitely is. So.
Yeah, I mean, especially now in like what we're seeing in Vancouver and Victoria, there's just like a million dispensaries everywhere now, and it seems like, I know, like marijuana is not legal yet, but you would get the impression that it was if you weren't from here.
Yeah, they actually opened a dispensary on campus at UBC, so that's cool.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, no, it's straight up legal in some U.S. states. I mean, Colorado and Oregon and probably others by now. But I mean, that's a different thing to get used to for sure. Of like, it's legal, but it ain't 100% legal because it's not legal at the federal level.
Right. Yeah.
So at the federal level, like, I don't know why we're talking about this really, but dispensaries, they can't have like a bank account. So they only deal in cash. So
I didn't know that.
I didn't know that either.
They still can't get a bank account, so because the federal law prohibits that. So banks won't touch them, even though like the state law says it's cool. The banks won't touch it, so you have to deal in cash. And I don't really know what the point of this is, other than to say is like it's in an intermediary state, right? Where, in my mind, it is. Because I grew up in a certain era, right, and I'm 155 years old, that it is like from the old days of like it's illegal, right? And like I wonder what the next generation of growing up like with a lifestyle dispensary down the street is like. It's probably going to be a different perception of it being legal or not, but.
And it's also, there's so many reasons about like, my friends and I, it's clear that you can just walk into a dispensary and get weed and get your prescription. But then like, what are you supposed to say is your illness? Like if you say anxiety or depression, they're not going to give it to you because, they're going to need more proof. So it's like, how do you negotiate that? It's all very sneaky still.
Yeah, I know in some states you can say damn near anything and get a prescription. Like insomnia. Like who doesn't have insomnia now and then?
My daughter certainly has it.
Oh God.
Sometimes. She's 5 months old. So.
That she's not getting a prescription then.
Is she about just sized?
About whose size?
Just sized.
Just size.
Yeah, just size. Yeah, she's like Probably 5 Infinite Jests weight-wise right now or something. How much does Infinite Jest weigh? Is it like 4 pounds?
I
4
don't know.
point something? I think I've seen that.
Kilogram?
I don't know kilograms at all. I'm Canadian, but I refuse to. There's certain things, I refuse to switch over from standard to metric. Weight's one of them.
That's reassuring to hear. I just assumed everyone there was talking about kilograms and kilometers and stuff.
Well, kilometers for sure, but most Canadians, we can deal in like feet and inches really well, and pounds.
There's a phone for that. There's a phone app for that, right?
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure there's like 1,000.
I can't deal in anything, so.
So we kind of talked about this a little bit, Shazia, already, but like, so talking about Wallace's style, and maybe we'll talk a bit about medium here. Like, as a poet, I've looked at some of your work recently, and it tends to be fairly minimalist in style, right? Like as a medium, 1-page poems, things like that. Now, barring like the epic, what is it that then like appeals to you about Wallace's sort of sense of maximalism in, specifically Infinite Jest and The Pale King? How do you see kind of like the discourse between what you do and what Wallace is doing? What interests you about that?
It's really interesting because I've never seen those two things in opposition, but I
Right.
feel like both of them have this, at least when I'm writing poetry, there's this obsession with being attentive to things in the same way that Wallace seems to be attentive to the sentence and to
Mm-hmm.
telling things in this very patient and wrought sort of way.
Mm-hmm. I think it
Yeah,
was
it's the attention, I think, that ties both of them together for me, or the quality of attention.
Mm-hmm. Like on the sentence level kind of thing.
Hmm.
Matt, was it Nicholas Giacoboni that said that there's not a lazy sentence in the entire book? I think that was him that said that.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
Well, I think you can see a lot of that in his editing style. I mean, or the way that he accepts edits or not. I mean, that's certainly visible in the Ransom Center. And there's this interview with him for Amherst Alumni Magazine about how he's a 5-draft man, and that's also very true. And that almost everything that's in the Ransom Center has 4 or 5 drafts, and of Infinite Jest there are some passages that have more than that, and same with the Pale King. There are passages that have 8, 9, 10, 11 drafts, and that kind of attention to the page and that kind of polishing, I think it does show some kind of like what he also expected out of his students. So I know as a teacher, he spent a lot of time. He did not like a lazy sentence, right? Mm-hmm. If you turned in some lazy sentences, you'd clearly not reread or edited or left in typos or had repetitive phrases. He was very quick to mark that up.
Wow. So what are the drafts like? Do you think he did he do it rewrite it line by line, or does it look like he rewrote the whole section afresh each time?
Both. I mean, both. There's some, lots of whole sections of Infinite Jest that were cut. There were a lot of pages that he really labored over. And, he changed the opening several times where for many drafts of the whole book, 4 drafts or so, the opening was the professional conversationalist scene where it was Hal trying to communicate with his father, behind this mask of like not really knowing it's his father. And then his father is the one who kind of breaks down that communication. And that the drafts of that scene, I know, were handwritten multiple times. So that kind of labor over like what word sounds good, you can tell that he, probably read some of the stuff aloud, changed the punctuation around to put in gaps. One of his signature punctuation things he stole really from Manuel Puig is the dot dot dot. Yeah, as like just a pause in conversation, or
and pinch on,
and it probably going back to like Shakespeare or something. It probably goes back even further. But
Cicero.
I mean that kind of attention to how does the book sound? That to me also sounds like something a poet would do.
Hmm.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely read my work out loud. I can't imagine Wallace reading out every page and trying to check, but
Yeah,
wow.
like handwriting each page twice and then word processing it several more times. Like the amount of time investment there is pretty staggering.
Wow, the book would have been framed so differently if the professional conversationalist scene was first. It would have been, to me, more of like a father-son narrative because it would have been
Mm.
set up that way. But the way it's set up now is kind of like very, solipsistic, lonely guy. I don't know.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and I think we've talked
Really
about
changed the
this
book for me.
on the podcast too, but like in one of those drafts, the character, in the early draft, the character is not Hal. Maybe we talk about this with David Herring. It was David Foster Wallace. And the character's name is David Wallace, and the father's name is James Wallace. And he kept it where the father's name in the book is James.
Right.
So that he did not, he changed himself out of it, but then kind of put himself back in with the Pale King. So
Yeah.
I know, like when the Pale King came out, I was surprised to see his name in there. Like, oh, he's doing this metafictional thing again.
Yeah.
But that does change the way you perceive the book. I think if the focus is on Hal and his father, but it's also in line somewhat with like Hamlet, which I
Sure.
see very
Yeah.
much as about like Hamlet and his father.
Yeah.
Again, not so much of a question. I've really got to find a way to like end this with like a profound question.
Maybe like okay, so talking about medium and minimalism, are there like what are some of the thematic things, Shazia, that you try and do in your poetic work that you see maybe like aligning with Wallace's program or things that are totally different? Like do you find any intersection points between
Yeah,
like
and
your
then
goals
just
as an artist maybe?
just what Matt said about the metafictional narration, that was actually how my poetry stuff got started. Like I was actually very interested in self-reflexivity, and I've been collecting and looking at all these passages of like self-conscious and metafictional narration in books by authors who had committed suicide. So I was looking at like Suicide by Edward LaVey and how he talks about it, which is an autobiography, and just how he talks about himself. And the book is basically like a rehearsal of his suicide, spoken as if it was his best friend who had committed suicide. And then obviously Wallace, I was thinking through that. So then that sort of, it's always been with me. Like Wallace has always been with me as I think through these like, similar themes in my work about mediation and suicide and self-consciousness in particular. So, yeah, so all of this interest in self-consciousness then just extended out into like immediate experience, and I was trying to articulate what that space of like being human and non-human, having these human and non-human technological actors in the same space would look like. And so, yeah, just that poem I shared with you guys earlier, that was on my friend Rob Taylor's blog. It actually clicked together when I remembered something that I think Karen Green had said about finding Wallace.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, I
Do you
can't
have that?
remember where I said that, where I read that. She wanted to place a chair beneath him so that his knees don't hurt when he falls.
Oh God.
Yeah, yeah.
Is that in Bow Down? Do you remember?
Yeah.
It must have
Yeah.
been, yeah. Yeah, so Wallace has been very much a part of my work, especially just the self-conscious narration in particular.
Is there kind of like a geographical Vancouver poetry scene sort of like theme or like recurring sort of thread of ideas that you see at work among poet like peers in your immediate space? Is your work kind of like anomaly in that group? Is it?
I don't know if it will be vain of me to say it's kind of an anomaly or what,
No, that's
but I
okay.
definitely
That's
feel
what I
like
want to know.
but
Tell
I
us about the
definitely
Vancouver
feel,
scene, you know?
yeah. There's different kinds of poets, but I feel like a lot of people tend to write about Vancouver as a place, especially with the things that are going on right now. It's just with housing and rental and everything's just in crisis. And I'm also
Sure.
writing about those kinds of things too.
Mhm.
But a lot of the poems that are being written by my peers right now are also kind of doing the New York poetry scene where, referencing friends and this intimate coterie of friends among each other. And, all my friends are on Reddit, so yay. So I'll just stick to writing poems about Wallace.
You got a wider international crew that you run with.
It's a very political scene, I'd say. And there's
very
definitely,
political scene, yeah.
Yeah, especially with my instructors from Simon Fraser University, like Jeff Dirksen and Stephen Colas. They're doing very political poetry that's kind of influenced by language poetry in the States in the 80s. And also, and then there's, UBC kind of group that's just very straight up lyric poetry in general. This is big generalizations, but I definitely see it as an institutional kind of split in different camps in that sense.
Huh. Well, that's cool. Going back sort of to that question of your desire to want to do like Wallace scholarship and maybe change programs or whatever, if you what are some ideas that you would want to pursue if you were to say write a master's thesis on Wallace? What are areas that you'd be really interested to explore?
Oh man.
Have you given that some thought?
I remember feeling very passionate about just the, mediated experience, which is basically all throughout Wallace, and just reading more about McLuhan, because I know he's mentioned McLuhan a few times in that McCaffrey interview. And now that I'm reading Pynchon, I'm gonna have to do something with Gravity's Rainbow and Infinite Jest, because there's so many similarities between both of them. And I think Wallace had said he never read Gravity's Rainbow, right? Did he say that?
I don't believe it.
Because he clearly owes so much to Pynchon.
Yeah, I'm surprised. This is the first time I'm reading Gravity's Rainbow, and there's just so many similarities between both the books.
Mm-hmm. What are some ones that stand out to you particularly?
Both the books have this grand corporate structure that influences all the actions happening. So in Pynchon, there's this film company that's related to a chemicals company that manufactures this plastic that's used to make the rockets, and also a latex suit that's in porn films with BDSM sex. And then in Infinite Jest, it's, interlaced telentertainment and the whole bit about syndication and how that filters through different sorts of streams.
Mm-hmm. So a larger geopolitical backdrop, and then subtext to that, you have the lives of the individual characters working within that kind of monolithic superstructure kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. And then there's characters taking on different character roles. So there's Tyrone Slothrop in Gravity's Rainbow, who has two identities. There's Ian Scuffling and there's Max Schlepsig, and then there's Marat and Sleepily and all these, and Joelle and Lucille Duquet,
Mm-hmm.
So it's various personas just gathering on top of one another.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned also in an email that Fantods you found in Gravity's Rainbow.
Yeah.
Do you remember the context of that?
I'm gonna have to pull it up again. But that was actually from Mark Twain originally, right? I did some research.
Oh, really?
I found it in Pynchon, yeah, and I think the pointer that I found was Mark Twain and not Pynchon.
Oh.
Just seems very 1970s to me. I don't know why I associate this with his mom coined a bunch of these words like greebles and stuff.
Right. Yeah.
And the howling Fantods in particular is you can see just anyone who loves language and loves these little one-off plays on words, just delighting in being able to use them. And there was a word Wallace used in Infinite Jest, and then it comes up later in an interview, and he's like, "No, I used that word," and he's so proud that he remembered that he was able to use a word. And that to me is another thing, what a poet would do. If you are very consciously putting a word in there, you will remember that forever, that you use that word. And I think Wallace secretly wanted to use every word.
Yeah. I found the passage probably ever. Yeah. I found the passage in Pynchon. Should I read it out?
Sure. Yeah.
Please.
It was always easy in open and lonely places to be visited by panic, wilderness, fear. But these are the urban Fantods here that come to get you when you are lost or isolate inside the way time is passing, when there's no more history, no time-traveling capsule to find your way back to. It's
So
kind of
yeah, it's
similar usage.
used kind
Yeah.
of similar context. Yeah, huh? That's
Urban
cool.
fantods. Yeah.
Urban.
Yeah.
Maybe if Nick Maniatis starts a Pynchon site, he can call it the Urban Fantods.
I often get the suburban fantods, not where I live.
Oh, I bet you do. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all urban fantods in Vancouver for sure right now.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So Shazia, you have Ennet House wrapping up here. Do you foresee any future plans for a fourth Infinite Jest guiding tour?
Oh, I think I'm actually going to take a break this time.
Yeah, that seems reasonable.
Yeah, maybe read the book chronologically myself because I haven't done a chronological read yet.
Oh, like take a map someone has made and like read through the subsidized time years from 1 to 9.
Yeah, yeah.
I've never done that either.
Machete order almost. I mean, you have to start with like that scene where Jim's father is lecturing him about
In Arizona in 1960.
Yeah.
Oh, man,
That's
so
like the best,
depressing.
one of the best scenes in the book, though. I think it's so
Yeah.
fun. It's depressing, but it's just like it makes me laugh. Like the pacing of it is so profoundly well done with the way you can see the effects of alcohol starting to happen from start to finish. It's unreal.
And also that bit about annihilation reminded me of Pynchon stuff too, because there's so much about the visibility of the atom and nuclear warfare in Pynchon, and he talks about how chemistry and all this chemistry stuff and being split. And that scene, especially with the annihilation, is just like you can see Jim in Condensa's like consciousness just like slowly dissociating from his dad in like various levels, and then he finally gets to annihilation and he's just totally doesn't care about his dad by the time he gets to there. At least that's how I read it. I just saw it as like various degrees of separation from his dad.
Oh, very much. And also just bringing in the Marlon Brando thing and the mixing the kind of pop culture with science and that really strong voice. Again, it sounds great to read aloud that voice, which is really almost like a theatrical monologue.
Yeah, and so many passages in Infinite Jest are unattributed dialogue, right? So it's definitely Wallace would have been thinking about voice too. Just how things sound and how you can identify someone just by the things that they say.
Yeah. I've been rereading, although of course you end up becoming yourself in the last few nights. And there's a part near the beginning where Wallace talks about how he thinks that his stuff read aloud doesn't work very well. And I just wonder about, like, as someone who works with words in a very specific way, like you do, Shazia, would you like take him to task on that? Do you think?
When I was trying to recruit people for the Ennet House group to read alongside in person, and every time I had a poetry reading, I'd always read out a passage from Good Old Neon about how it's difficult to articulate things and how the speed of consciousness and that passage. And I'd read it over and over again, and it was just I found myself going so out of breath, like I actually had to practice saying it in the breath to try to say it the way he wrote it, and I was
Like you have to like
harrowing.
do like deep sea diver breath training to be able to like inhale that much oxygen to read an entire sentence.
Yeah, totally. I wasn't a Zen master by the end of it, but it took a lot of breathing.
It's funny. There's also a part in all the, of course, where Wallace says that to read the book well, you have to take at least a couple months. It's like anybody that hasn't spent at least 2 months reading it hasn't read it well, or something like that. And I was just thinking about that in terms of the timeline of these online reads, is that they tend to be like 3 months, right? That's about what 75 pages a week works out to. So well done to Phil and Mark Flanagan and the people who have mapped out how we read this book. It seems like Wallace would have approved.
Yeah, I actually
timeline.
stole the Infinite Winter schedule, but then sectioned in break weeks, so that would be like a break week of like 10 days just to catch up after every 300 or so pages.
Oh, that's nice.
Yeah, and people appreciated that, they seem to, but people did fall off for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, even as a guide, it's challenging to keep up some weeks for sure. And then you have to rely on like previous times that you've read the book and kind of skim ahead and be like, okay, what's this about? Yeah, okay, I think I could elucidate that a little bit for a first timer.
Yeah, yeah. There's like a lot of ripping off of yourself in previous guides.
Yeah, I bet. That's cool.
Yeah, I think as a general rule, the fiction writers don't think much about reading it aloud. And especially if it's your first book. This was not Wallace's first book, so I think maybe he's a little more conscious of it, that the book is going to come out, he's going to have to promote it and have to stand in front of people and read something. And it was curious that I think mostly read set pieces that could be understood on their own, rather than trying to like talk about a specific plot line. So that's why I know he frequently read the video phone portion, just because it's funny. And I think that can also skew the perception of the book, that if your perception of it is like, wow, it was hilarious, and there's a quote on the blurb on the book that it's like, oh, it's really funny, then it might be in for a surprise when you buy this 1,000-page novel and be like, oh, where's the jokes at? But that idea about, what are you, the novel itself, your perception of it for a writer, I don't know that they're thinking about how it's going to sound or what they're going to read when they're writing it. And, I'm probably arguing against myself here, since I just said the opposite about 20 minutes ago. But I think in a lot of cases, what you hear for people who love Infinite Jest is people who say it sounds like my brain voice. And, when you're silently reading it, it's like, well, that's how I silently perceive the world, or I deal with myself, or I think of things as well. And then the ability to translate it into a written page is like, that's kind of the holy grail, right? Like if you can do that and people, feel less alone, they feel like, well, that's me too. Then you've really done, something special. But as a writer, I have no idea how you approach that, because I really don't consider myself a writer.
Yeah, it's super difficult. Like I feel like I'm trying to be more conscious of that as I'm writing myself, because I'm just starting out writing fiction. I don't want to write like Wallace, just starting out, but I'm definitely aware of how the narration really helps with that feeling of closeness, like how it sounds like a brain voice, because it's like limited omniscient, so the narration is just blurring into the character's narration. There's almost no gap between the narration and the character's consciousness, which is where I find the beauty of it really comes through.
Well, I what you just said, though, I think is interesting, because sometimes, especially writers starting out, get contradictory advice there. Like, write for yourself, and you write, what feels true to you, and that's the most important thing. And I feel like we see a lot of that right now with writing that feels very confessional. And then the opposite is kind of like, well, no, you need to be considerate of the reader, or you need to imagine that you're writing to someone specifically who is going to read this. And then there's a bit of like egotism behind that, which is like, well, then I hope millions of people read my words and are influenced by them. Just like that idea that I'm going to project my voice out through the world, and I hope that it resonates and every ear is turned towards my voice. That's a little like extreme, but you also can't just say, I hope no one ever reads this, and it reads like, a diary to yourself. So
because there's that tension. Wallace talks about, like, I know that, like, I'm writing this novel, and the primary function of it is that it has to entertain the reader, right? Especially in the first 5 pages, or else I've lost them.
Yeah, and in that McCaffrey interview, he says something like, to be a fiction writer, you have to be disassociated from yourself, or disentangled from yourself, or something like that. So there's also this like double consciousness going on, where you're like constantly aware of, you're writing and who's going to be reading it, and at the same time you have to like write as if you don't care.
And I've been thinking about that a lot in terms of Knausgaard, and so I might have to do
Right,
a
yeah.
separate episode to talk about that. But I just don't read enough.
We'll try and get him on.
Yeah, right. I don't
Yeah.
read
Carl.
enough like poetry, I guess. You know, a lot of the poetry that I return to is stuff that I've already read, and I would love it if you could recommend maybe some poems for people who like Infinite Jest.
Oh, wow. Hmm. I would definitely recommend a book of prose poems by Franz Wright. Let's see, I forgot what it's called.
Kindertotenwald?
That's the one. Yes, that's the one.
Kindertotenwald. It looks interesting.
Yeah, and Franz Wright was also, and he wrote a lot about recovery and addiction, and he also has some religious themes in his work, which I think would tie into Wallace.
Sure. Yeah, that's come up a few times on the show.
See, I've never really read him or his father, James Wright, which I'm aware of, are the father and son pair, very successful poets. I think Franz Wright just died recently. Did he die?
Yeah, he died recently, I think a few years ago. I'm not sure when.
2015, 2016, something like that. That's a fantastic recommendation. Do you associate Wallace with other poems or types of poetry?
I always associate Wallace with Dennis Johnson, who's, I guess he's started out as a poet, but also as a fiction writer. But it's always in my mind, too, with Wallace. I guess because of the themes.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is also Dennis just died this year, and I feel like in some weird way Wallace was competitive with him, or resented him in a weird way. I know that he loved Angels. He recommended that novel a lot, and Angels is a very bleak novel. If you haven't read it, it's very dark. But everything Dennis Johnson wrote, is somewhat bleak, but it's also somewhat like poetic. I think that's a good connection there.
Connection point.
Yeah, because I see Dennis Johnson was a recovering drug addict and wrote a lot about that. And I think there's some quote Wallace says that, some recovering writers use it as material and they get a pass. And I was like, what? That's kind of exactly what Wallace did. He used his history with addiction as material for a book. And but he also, I think the Alcoholics Anonymous kind of code of anonymity kept him from speaking about it too much, or his own personal experience. And I think he kind of took issue with writers who put themselves in the forefront of it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. But then I guess the counterpoint to that could be was it Big Craig who at Granada House said it was pretty obvious that he was here just mining material for his writing. So maybe if Wallace didn't use his own direct experience, he was using that of others potentially. Is that another? Yeah.
Yeah, and didn't he also transcribe stories at AA meetings and NA meetings and then use them in the book too?
Yeah.
Is there something disingenuous about that? I won't use my own, but I'll use that of others in my group.
Yeah. I think he also recommended Incognito Lounge, which I think is Dennis Johnson's first book of poetry.
Yes, you're correct.
Yeah, he was like, this is the best book of poetry or something for Salon or something like that.
Yeah, again, I think it's something he was competitive with in a weird way that he never acknowledged. I mean, and Dennis Johnson got a lot of recognition in a way that Wallace, at least during his lifetime, didn't. And maybe I'm incorrect about that, but I mean, Dennis Johnson won the National Book Award and was on a sort of different level where Jesus' Son was made into a movie. I think that needs to be explored more. We need to talk more about this Dennis Johnson thing.
Yeah, I just started reading Jesus' Son because my fiction prof, John Vina, he recommended it to me because obviously I'm just mining my experience with addiction and depression from my stories. So and he's
Well,
like, you should really read Dennis Johnson. I was like, fine, Wallace recommended him, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, sure. Seems good.
well, in a way, I think that's somewhat to be expected from someone like Wallace, who grew up in in the Midwest and lived a pretty like upper middle class life, and didn't have a lot of external forces to struggle with besides substances. And
Right.
his relationships with his family or his relationships romantically, that he also mined that, and so but it's like, what else is a writer to do? What else, unless you take like the William Volman approach, where it's like you're going to go to Yugoslavia and Afghanistan and
Yeah.
Antarctica, and you're going to be like a world explorer. I think Wallace is very much saying the world is, in your bedroom with a sheet of blank paper, to write about the day. Like that's another way of seeing the world.
Yeah, totally. And the things that he pays attention to, just like conversations, just with the with the father and the mother and the relationships and the Joelle and Oren. It's so real. Like that stuff's necessary, right? To talk about in fiction. It doesn't have to be something so grand and epic all the time, because this is the real stuff that matters.
Well, in the 1980s too, whenever Raymond Carver style of minimalism was dominating fiction scene. I mean, that's when Broom and System came out in that world in 1987, and that idea of a gritty, real voice and circumstance was still somewhat new in highbrow fiction. And they were coming from the world of like John Updike and John Cheever and Philip Roth. And they did not write about trailer parks, and they did not write about the dive bar. And, reading Dennis Johnson, reading, even what Wallace was trying to do with different voices while he was in an MFA program, I think it's coming from that place of intentionally against, the dominant style of literary fiction in America up to that point.
Yeah, the proper realist stuff. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I guess that brings us to the final thoughts portion of the evening. Shazzy, is there anything that we haven't covered yet that you were hoping to, anything that occurred to you while we were talking that that sparked an idea? Any concluding remarks?
I want to ask a question. Can you see the edits and all the drafts online, or you have to go to Harry Ransom to do that?
There's a fair amount of this stuff that's online from the Pale King, and I don't know if there's much from Infinite Jest. I think that that's something that came up the other day in relation to Oz Wallace when we were talking. When I was talking with them, is that the question of like, when are the Ransom Center going to put more online so that people around the world have access to these materials. And it's just not the way literary archives typically work, but I hope that with Wallace that they do get permission and rights to put more scanned pages online. But there's tens of thousands of pages there, so it would take a while to do them all.
Can you justify a trip to UBC, Shazia, to go down to the Ransom Center for any of your work, do you think?
I am definitely going to try. Now, whether I get into the States because of all my Muslim names, that's another problem. But I'm definitely going to try at some point, I think.
Cool. Nice.
Oh, the other thing I wanted to bring up was Greg Jackson.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with this writer.
Matt, are you familiar?
No, I haven't read him. I saw that story he has in a VQR that's about tennis. Have you read that story? Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, he's amazing. He put out this book called Prodigals. I think it was put out this year. And I think I just came across him when I was just on the internet and looking at Granta, and I came across the first paragraph. I only read the first paragraph because the rest of it was locked. From this story called Epithalamium about this divorced couple, and it was just so convoluted and attentive, and I was like, this is so messed up. I just have to buy the book. And so I bought it.
Convoluted and attentive is what sells you, hey? Nice.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And so, yeah, I bought the book. And then when I started reading the book, there's a story called Servant Volley near Vichy.
Mm-hmm.
And it's basically about this famous tennis player. His name is Léon Descoteaux, who lives in the rural area of France. And this couple goes to visit him, and they wake up in the middle of the night, and they find each other playing tennis with no one but themselves in like the 3 a.m. And then Léon Descoteaux films them and then sends them a VHS tape of them playing tennis. And the tape that he films is all his like signature moves of the match that he won, and that made him give up tennis ever after. And it's just very, very Wallacey and Infinite Jesty all over it.
I'm sold, man. Now that this book
that sounds great. I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah, it looks amazing. I'm definitely going to check this out.
Yeah, and now when I was reading an interview with Greg Jackson, people had apparently compared him to Wallace, and he said he's influenced by him. So yay!
Oh, wow, cool. We will link to that story in the show notes for sure. Fantastic.
Well, thanks for coming on tonight and talking with us, and best of luck with your writing on your own, and thanks for all the work that you've done on behalf of people reading Infinite Jest, especially for the first time. It really does help to have a guide, I think.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
for sure. You guys have been my guides too, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Shazia. And we also want to wish you all the best luck with Jeff Seaver's class, and we hope you get, a sparkling A out of it. We'll try and put in a good word for you with Jeff in the back channels. Shazia, if people want to check out some of your work, get in touch with you through Twitter and things like that, where can people find you online?
On Twitter, I'm at Shazia_R, and my book is on Anstruther Press. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool.
And if you want to find Matt and Dave on Skype, it's Matt Booker 2015 and _Laird.
Yes, you can add us.
Go for it.
Yeah. Thanks for that plug, Shazia. Cool. And if people want to get in touch with us, you can find us on Twitter. We are at Concavity Show, and we're Concavity Show on Instagram as well. If you want to email us, we are concavityshow@gmail.com. And speaking of emails, Matt, I got an email from someone here who lives in Victoria named Hannah Yoon Henderson, who reached out I think in August about just getting together and having a beer and talking about Wallace. And I was like, great, there's kind of an enclave of people who have met before. So I got in touch with Tim Persone and Christopher Douglas. And turns out Hannah was a student of Tim's currently. And so the three of us and another friend just got together this week, went out for beer. And Hannah told me that in the summer he discovered our show and listened to every episode in like 2 or 3 days on like a huge binge. So
I do not recommend that. That's not the way to go.
Yeah, I wanted to ask him, like, how did you see the progression of our show from like episode 1 to present? Have we improved? Hopefully the sound quality is better at least. Things like that.
I don't even really want to talk about it, to be honest with you. I just put these out there and then just move on. Tomorrow's a new day. We'll talk about something else tomorrow. This is great.
Awesome. Cool. As usual, we want to thank Robin O'Neill for her art, and we want to thank the band Parquet Courts for their song Instant Disassembly. And unfortunately, by the time this episode comes out, Robin O'Neill's book tour in Texas will be over. But Matt, she's in your hood on the 20th, and
I'm going.
I think you're gonna go meet Robin and hang out, get her book.
I'm gonna go.
I'm very jealous.
It's gonna be in a good times. I'll take a picture. Cool. We'll put it online.
Yeah, that'd be great. Excellent. Very cool. All right, Shazia.
Can I do one more thing?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Shout out to my friends on Reddit. Hey.
Any specific name drops you want to do?
Yeah, especially to A High Time.
A High Time. That's a good thematic name.
I'm spelled Thyme. Yeah.
Oh, nice. Cool.
I'm on Reddit. If you want to add me on there as a user, tag me or something. I'm on there. So.
Oh, I'm Concavity Show on Reddit.
I'm just Matt Booker. I post occasionally in the R Austin subreddit. So.
Oh, what's that all about?
It's mostly about the Chili's at 45th and Lamar Street.
That's amazing.
It's an inside joke.
Oh, nice. I sometimes post on the Netrunner Reddit under username Concavity Show. So
Shocker.
yeah, right. Thanks again, Shazia. It's been great having you on.
Welcome. Bye, guys.
Thanks. Take care.
I'm typing. This is probably just blowing the mic, right?
Wide open. I'll just cut this stuff. It's fine. We'll make it sound like you had the answer instantly. We do this all the time on the show.
Okay, good. I don't feel so un-PhD-like anymore.
Oh yeah, it's like the opening line of Good Old Neon. Like, my whole life I've been a fraud. That's the whole premise of this show.
Yeah.
Is we just cut things when we don't know the answer right away, and then we just make it look like we knew it. Right, Matt?